Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Welcome to episode 2 in a series where we take a look at current popular endgame unique items. Today we're going to be looking at Taste of Hate, which is a flask that has been a consistent powerhouse for a very long time in PathOfExile, and that is really central to the meta in 3.24, and unless there's major changes, I can see it continuing to be into the future. We're going to look at what makes Taste of Hate so good, we're going to look at how you can get it, and also a number of other curiosities with this item. But firstly, just give you a quick heads up that this is me bringing back an old series. Back in 2021, I did videos looking at endgame unique items. Those videos mostly haven't stood the test of time. Some of them have, but some of them haven't. And so I'm rebooting the whole series, and I'm going to start looking at some unique items that I did back then, but also a number that I didn't do back then. Let's start by breaking down the wording on this item. Firstly, it is an 8-second duration, which is long. This is 9.6 seconds with default quality, and if you get really lucky overqualitying it, you can get as long as 10.4 seconds. Additionally, 20 charges is not a lot to be consumed, and 50 flask charges maximum is quite a lot. So Taste of Hate can have quite a high uptime compared to other powerful unique flasks like Dying Sun that are much more stingy on their uptime. Now this flask provides additional damage. Gain 10 to 15% of physical damage added as extra cold damage during effect is all upside on the item, but really it's not the thing people want this item for. That's a little bonus, it's a meaningful bonus, and especially on some builds it can be fantastic, but the main reason you're using this is that 10 to 15% physical damage shifting into cold, that first line. So the exact wording is 10 to 15% of physical damage from hits is taken as cold damage during effect. So when Taste of Hate is active on your character, if you would take 4,000 physical damage from one source, instead you'll take 3,400 physical and 600 cold damage. This cold damage is then going to attack your cold resistance, and because of this flask, and also just because cold resist is easier to build into a build than raw physical damage mitigation is, this ends up being really strong. But the other thing that's incredibly powerful, and we'll come to this later, is that this bypasses monster physical overwhelm. Physical damage can be mitigated by a few things: endurance charges, flat physical damage mitigation on items, and also by armor. But all of these are subject to being really brutally attacked by monsters that have physical damage overwhelm, and Taste of Hate bypasses that by taking 15% of that hit, assuming you've got a perfect roll one and no additional flask effect, and then just simply removing that from the equation, changing it into cold damage where physical overwhelm doesn't scale it any further. The second thing I'll say is that this top line, this 10 to 15% of physical damage shifted into cold, this stacks in the best possible way with other similar mods. For example, Lightning Coil's 50% of physical damage taken from hits is suffered as lightning damage, or Cloak of Flame's 40% of physical damage, not specifying that it's just from hits, is taken as fire damage. And particularly if you min-max a lot, you can get a Watcher's Eye that has physical damage suffered as X element while you're under the effect of purity of elements or other auras. This can be really strong, especially if you can get more than one of these mods on one Watcher's Eye. Or you can use Dawnbreaker or a whole bunch of other mechanics. But the critical thing is Taste of Hate. Always Taste of Hate is a key part to scaling up this stat, and because it scales in the most favorable way possible, the more of this stat you can get, this physical damage shifting, the better each point of it becomes. Now I want you to assess the item as though the chill avoidance and the freeze avoidance didn't exist, because you probably are going to get 100% chill avoidance and freeze avoidance from other sources. You probably want to be always immune to those effects rather than just immune while you're under the effect of Taste of Hate. They're a bonus, certainly, but they're not particularly critical to the value of the item. Additionally, Taste of Hate has more than just the explicit modifiers as effects. It also has the base effects of a Sapphire Flask. 40% cold resistance, probably neither here nor there because you want to be cold res capped when this flask is down, but also 5% to maximum cold resistance. This is a really significant bonus, especially given that you're going to be taking more cold damage while it's on than you would be taking otherwise. Now it's worth noting that Taste of Hate has a moderately wide roll range here. The critical stat is 10 to 15%, and there's also a secondary stat that is also 10 to 15%. It is the physical damage shifting that's the important one, and the other one is a bonus. In a mature trade league, 14 and 15% on the physical shifting roll tend to sell for quite a bit, and 10 to 13% rolls generally get fed into the 3-for-1 recipe for unique items. So you put in 3 of these low rolled Taste of Hates and you receive back a randomly rolled one, which could end up being a 15% if you're lucky. But if the trade league is new, or if you're playing in solo self-found, you can directly apply a Divine Orb instead, and that's quite a reasonable use of these rare currency items. So what is it that makes Taste of Hate so good? Well, without sources of increased flask effect, it's a good item. With sources of increased flask effect, it is spectacular. It's one of the easiest flasks in the game to maintain near permanent uptime on. If you've got 30% flask effect on the tree, as you probably will have as a Pathfinder, and a further 10% from a high uptime on Alchemist Genius buff, then you're looking at 40% total flask effect for 21% physical damage shifted into cold. With 50% shifting from Lightning Coil, this ends up being 42% of what you need in order to reach the magical cap of 100, where physical damage is a complete non-factor for you. Of course, just getting very close to that cap is good as well. So that's 71% just from those two items, and then you can use Dawnbreaker, especially a Corrupted Dawnbreaker, a physical damage shifting helmet, which I've got a guide to crafting, which I'll link to at the end of this video, and the Armor Energy Shield Mastery that provides physical damage shifting into Chaos, if your Chaos resistance is high enough to use that effectively. All of these sources can definitely get you to the cap, and at a higher budget, much higher in some cases, a Watcher's Eye that has multiple of those purity mods can get you there even without using Lightning Coil. So what do you achieve if you manage to get 100% physical damage shifting? Well, it means that you can ignore armor and treat it as a complete dump stat on your character. Your defenses become 4 numbers, the 3 elemental resistances and your chaos resistance. And just to be clear here, you can still use other defensive layers on top of the 4 resistances. You can use block, you can use life recoup, you can use progenesis, you can use all sorts of other mechanics, but you get enough defense to stay alive just out of your 4 resistances being capped and having 100% of physical damage shifted into other elements, as long as you can deal with the weaknesses we'll come to in a sec. Ultimately, resists are much easier to get than physical damage mitigation, and most damage you'll take in Path of Exile begins life as physical damage. Potentially though, even better, you can use it in conjunction with the Timeless Duel exclusive keystone Transcendence. More on that in a sec, but Transcendence is incredibly strong once you address the significant weaknesses that it's got. And Transcendence comes from the Militant Faith Timeless Duel, and ones specifically that call out the name Maxarius on them. I did just want to put in a quick little aside though, if you play in Standard, you're not limited to 10 to 15%. There are Legacy Tastes of Hate from patch 2.2 and also a small number that were added through the Legacy keys, I think in patch 2.6, and these are completely ridiculous. 30% physical damage shifted into cold. These are completely crazy, they're extremely expensive, good luck getting one, but if you do get one, you'll be very, very hard to kill indeed. So let's talk Transcendence. Transcendence has a text. Armor applies to fire, cold, and lightning damage taken from hits instead of physical damage. So armor provides no physical mitigation, but it applies at full strength to each type of element damage. And then minus 15% to all maximum elemental resistances. This has a very severe drawback in that it makes you tremendously vulnerable to physical damage, but of course, you can address that through all of these physical shifting shenanigans we were talking about. And then, with Transcendence providing you with tremendous additional mitigation of cold, lightning, and fire damage, you end up being very, very tanky indeed. Now you must have considerable amounts of physical damage shifting, and you also need to have some solution to the minus 15% to all maximum elemental resistances here. One thing that's critical to note here is that armor works better against small hits, and it works in the best possible way with resistances. If you take 10,000 raw fire damage from a hit, then firstly that will attack your fire resistance, and if your fire resistance is say 72% because Transcendence is nerfing it a bit, then at that case that's 2800 fire damage that's coming through. The armor calculation is then based upon you suffering 2800 damage, not 10,000 damage, and armor works better on small hits. This is why armor has such strong synergy with elemental resistances. So Transcendence can really round out a defensive package well, but the drawbacks are high. There's what we've talked about already about dealing with physical hits, which you need to deal with through these shifting mechanisms, and you also need to be able to deal with elemental damage over time and physical damage over time. But if you can do that, then the Transcendence package is extremely strong. The maximum resistances drawback here is really severe, and one way that you can deal with this is through the use of the unique chest Lawweave, or replica Lawweave as well, but Lawweave tends to be the stronger of the two. But this has an incredibly high impact on the rest of your build, because Lawweave means you can't use Lightning Coil or Cloak of Flame, which are the biggest sources of physical damage shifting. You become more reliant upon the Taste of Hate flask, you become more reliant upon other sources of physical damage taken as X. It is, however, still possible to shift all of this damage, but that will generally require a mirror's investment or more. And Taste of Hate is an absolutely critical component of any setup that uses Transcendence, Lawweave, and full physical shifting. So let's talk about how you get this item. The original way is simply for it to drop for you from a regular monster that you kill. Taste of Hate can drop from any monster in the game, subject to an as yet unknown minimum level. As of 3.24, it is known to be in what players term Tier 2 rarity. This is rare enough that it's extremely unreliable that you'll be able to source it in solo self-found, but it's not rare in a mature trade league. In a mature trade league, you might have a situation where only 15% of the player base find this item, but only 8% of them want it. And that means that there's more supply than is needed to meet the demand, even though many individual players that do want it personally don't see it drop for them. We suspect Tier 2 uniques to be about 30 times as rare as Goldrum, to give you a bit of a comparison point. Now it's worth noting that grinding gear games do change around the tiers of uniques without notice, and so while at the moment it's Tier 2, I'm not going to make any promises at all that it will be Tier 2 next league. For example, Defiance of Destiny, 3.23 it was Tier 1, 3.24 it's definitely Tier 0, which is a considerable jump in rarity. As for level requirements for this item to drop, there's none that are really well documented. The minimum level to equip it is level 18, and it may well be that Taste of Hate can drop from monsters that are capable of dropping level 18 loot, but I'm not going to promise that to be the case. Most of the ones, in fact overwhelmingly the ones that are available for trade, have come from maps, and so expect that if you are going to get it the original way, it's probably going to be from maps. So to maximise your chance of getting a direct monster drop of Taste of Hate, you want to run maps that have a large number of map modifiers. Each map modifier adds a boost to quantity, rarity, and to pack size on the map, and these all multiply together. Essentially you're triple dipping on your chances of getting this, and the more map modifiers you can add the better, and additionally the more increased effect you can scale of map modifiers the better as well. Player magic find gear is also a major factor here. It's not like any one of these 5 factors is particularly big on its own. That is, the pack size inherent to the area you're playing in, the item quantity boost inherent to the area you're playing in, the item rarity boost inherent to the area you're playing in, the item quantity boost that is on your character's equipment, and the item rarity boost that is on your character's equipment. But as you know from Path of Exile, there's a big difference between a 6-link gem's damage and a 1-link gem. And that is because with a 6-link, none of those individual boosts that you get from a support gem is all that big on its own, but they all multiply together. And exactly the same principle applies with Magic Find, and that is the reason that it is so much more likely to show up when you're late in progression than it is early on. All of this said, the item is still rare as a direct monster drop. If you're getting 50 unique items dropping each map that you run, a direct monster drop of Taste of Hate may well take you 100 maps to see. We kind of suspect it's maybe about 1 in 5,000 unique items that drop will be Taste of Hate, although I'm not going to guarantee that that number is exactly right. So there's another way to get this though, and that is from divination cards. The divination card The Hunger drops from monsters in Abomination, Phantasmagoria, Core, Carcass, and Malformation maps. In addition, there's a couple of campaign zones, but you do not want to be farming this in the campaign. The card is rare, and you'll definitely get it much faster if you wait until maps. Now, grinding gear games generally balance Tier 2 unique divination cards around the assumption that the items that they provide are 4 to 5 times as special as a Divine Orb. So that means that each individual card is about 35% the drop rate of the Fortunate. You might find in trade that it's easier just to farm the Fortunate cards and then keep going until you've got enough wealth to trade either for a completed flask or for any missing hunger cards if you decide to go down the divination card route. That's entirely up to you, but if you're playing in solo self-found where that's not an option, expect that compiling 9 of this card will be about as much effort as it would be to compile 25 copies of the divination card The Fortunate. Taste of Hate has had an interesting impact on builds and also an interesting place in the meta that's evolved over the last 10 or so leagues. Grinding Gear Games gigabuffed Determination in patch 3.16 to the point that it felt like it was almost starting to become a boot stomping down on build diversity. Determination was so good that you felt like you had to run it and you had to warp your build in order to fit it in. Grinding Gear Games always try to restore build diversity, and sometimes that means dealing with some of these extremely powerful outliers. The way Grinding Gear Games did it though was not something that I would have chosen. What they've gone and done is provided weaknesses in a defensive setup that's based around armor, and that is allowing monsters to scale up the stat physical damage overwhelm to the moon. And once they've got a really high percentage of physical damage overwhelm, it means that armor becomes a really unreliable defensive source on its own. So players start looking for alternatives, and that's where physical damage shifting becomes as popular and as powerful as it is now. What Taste of Hate ends up doing is allowing players a way to fight back against Grinding Gear Games' attempt to counteract how they overbuff Determination. I think it would be a much better idea if GGG were to nerf the amount of physical damage overwhelm monsters could get and just directly address determination by reducing the numbers on that aura. But that's a totally different conversation, and today we wanted to talk about Taste of Hate, not the state of the meta, so I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results.